All right, I think it should be noon in Toronto. Lanrick, may I invite you to kick off proceedings for our third and final session here for today.
Okay, you guys can hear me all right? Wonderful. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lanrick Bennett. Just want to thank the organizers for allowing us the time and space to have a really important discussion this afternoon. Again, Lanrick Bennett, I'm the executive director for a small non-for-profit called Charlie's Freewheels, where we use bicycles to support the development of empowered young leaders and self-assured young cyclists. My part-time gig on the weekends, I was appointed Toronto's first bicycle mayor back in 2021, so far away, by an Amsterdam-based NGO called Bikes, BYCS. Our session this afternoon, is titled The Just Cycling City, Inclusive Cycling Promotion, Lifestyles, and Urban Transformation Across the GTHA. Hoping that this is going to be a broader conversation than just talking about Toronto, the center of the universe. I joke, but definitely we want to be able to open the conversation to much more than what is happening here in Toronto. So as GTHA residents increasingly opt to use bicycles for various trips, some areas seem close to achieving a critical mass of cyclists. Nonetheless, many barriers remain before cycling can fully enter the mainstream as a normal and everyday transportation mode. Inequities in cycling rates along dimensions of gender, race, and age continue to limit the potential of cycling. Suburban areas, where a majority of GTHA residents live, have also seen much less comprehensive improvements for cycling. The GTHA cannot achieve a critical mass of cyclists if it ignores barriers to cycling specific to these population and places. Cycling promotion must be an inclusive and consider a diversity of lifestyles to foster the just cycling city. These significant obstacles to the mainstreaming of cycling across the GTHA demand a holistic approach that goes beyond infrastructure alone to consider culture, economies, and lifestyles. One key aspect to consider is whether the significant urban development and intensification occurring across the GTHA could be better leveraged to facilitate cycling rather than pricing potential cyclists out of centrally located and more bikeable neighborhoods. Thinking beyond the provisions of infrastructure alone to consider the wider socio-material affordance for diverse cycling practices, we've invited participants to reflect on the construction of systems, vulnerability, adapt to the varying urban contexts across the GTHA. Asking yourselves, what does and could the bicycle facilitate in different locations? We'd like to inquire as to the detriments of inequalities in accessing opportunities, activities, and destinations by bicycle, their variations across urban contexts, and the effectiveness of targeting interventions. How recreational and transport cycling relate to each other in different spatial contexts, and what synergies can be leveraged. Is a focus on recreational facilities in suburban contexts limiting the position for transportation cycling? And finally, how upcoming technologies such as electric micromobility and future-oriented infrastructural policies could be leveraged to overcome barriers to mainstreaming and facilitation of winter cycling, a big piece in general. So we've got an action-packed afternoon. We're going to be wrapping up at 1. I want to roll right into our first presenter. Dr. Rebecca Myers is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Waterloo, where she examines the structural and societal systems that impede access to safe and inclusive environments. In particular, she is investigating 3 competent areas: equitable access and participation in active transportation, placemaking initiatives to promote social connectiveness and physical activity, and community engagement techniques for equitable involvement in public policy. She uses quantitative methodology necessary to uncover deficiencies in our existing social systems and enable access to safe, environmentally friendly, healthy living practices. The title of Rebecca's talk today is The Politics of Cycling Infrastructure. And let me welcome Rebecca. So good to see you.
Hi, Lanrick. Thanks so much for the great introduction. I will share my screen here.
Just before you start, Rebecca, just for audience members, please throw your questions into the chat. We will definitely get into there. And yeah, Rebecca, it's all yours.
All right, you can see the correct desktop. Great. So yeah, hi everyone. I'm Rebecca, and I've just completed my postdoc, actually starting a new role at TransLink in Metro Vancouver. So I'm excited to apply some of these policies outside of academia now, and would be interested in hearing all your thoughts in the chat and in the comments. So I want to talk to you today about some of the work that I did on the politics of cycling infrastructure, offering a new perspective on how we think of and plan for equity in the decision-making process. So in this presentation, I'll focus on 5 overarching questions. First is, what is the cycling infrastructure decision-making process? How is it typically taught in planning schools? How does this process work in reality? What inequities result from it? And of course, what can be done about it? So first, what do I mean when I talk about cycling infrastructure decision-making process? Well, it's really the process of identifying, planning, funding, developing, and eventually evaluating all of these cycling projects. And how is this process typically taught? Well, here's a fun diagram I made from some of my 30+ research participants who are all asked about how does this process really, how is it taught, and tell me a little bit more about it. So this was also cross-referenced with some texts on the topic, but first we start off with the guiding planning documents up at the top here. So typically a transportation master plan where we get the policy direction, determine from there a 5-year capital budget, where planners will then do things like leverage development and typically use things like development cost levies to fund infrastructure projects, as well as other cost sharing mechanisms. And then after the projects have been prioritized at that moment, the project itself will undergo a planning of its own. So each project will list its own purpose, goals, policies, directives, and here we see all of this happening. They then design, construct, build, and then hopefully evaluate and monitor on an ongoing basis. And all of this is happening while there's active engagement in the public, and then the information goes towards influencing future long-term goals back at the very top. So hopefully a very cyclical process, but there's the process that is typically taught. But how does this work in reality? And the answer is in its politics. So this shows all of the mechanisms of influence that are important throughout the decision making. So in yellow, you'll see all different groups. We obviously have at the start the politicians, council members that are in charge of these planning directives, long-term planning documents, approval, policy direction, capital plans. And then cities are often reliant on developers and their developments to fund a lot of these projects. Second is the staff who work on all of these documents to determine the network, how they build it out. And then we have those involved in the planning, prioritizing, and engagement on the project. So often consultants, other stakeholders like business improvement associations, advocacy groups, resident groups, hopefully academics along the way, all help and hindered by the role and portrayal in the media. So oftentimes media outlets can help or hinder a lot of the time when they get some bad press. It's never looking good, and then disseminates groups of people. So in the end, what inequities result from this process, you may ask? Well, first, we often find that from this process that much of the cycle network is determined by the decision to develop or not develop an area. Because if this is how the projects are funded through development cost levies, the issue with this is that it can only be used, this funding, in the location itself, rather than going to a pooled fund to equitably distribute infrastructure based on need. So this is why we often see 100 meters or less of a cycle path that's perfect, and then it ends, resulting in this sort of piecemeal construction. So it needs to be a little bit more methodical. And obviously, this is why we see sometimes gentrification and cycling as a symbol of gentrification and displacement, because an older property is redeveloped. It brings with it some pristine cycling infrastructure that would have been a great asset for the community beforehand. But funding didn't get allocated there because there wasn't this instigation of development. So another inequity that results from this process is that certain powerful groups are heard louder than others, and others aren't actively sought out in the process in order to include this multitude of voices. So, for example, a separated cycleway is proposed on a street like on Yonge Street in Toronto, but the Business Improvement Association will vehemently oppose the project, arguing they have no place for customers to park, for shipments to be dropped off, and they'll arrive at council or a town hall in large group members behind them, and then the cycleway is never approved, despite it being an integral part of the cycling network for people's experiences. So, what can be done about these inequities? So first, we can focus on building the cycling network out that's safe, secure, well thought out, with even a skeleton network invested in. So at least there are some bare bones that are connected and safe, and people know that, with greater innovations and iterations along the way. And then I always like to say that cycling networks are only as good as its weakest link. So it's important that you don't make cycling this dangerous, terribly disconnected activity. Otherwise, people won't choose to participate, or they won't continue doing it if you get them on a bike. So next is to try our best to uncouple this cycling infrastructure from development. So either trying to have larger city projects, or go toward pooling money together in order to determine infrastructure based on need, rather than having more piecemeal development based on, right in front of a development, it would be better. And then third is using a variety of engagement techniques to increase representation. So town halls haven't been working for a long time in order to garner a lot of representation. So things like intercept surveys, en route feedback, even on pilot projects, have been shown to garner a lot more feedback from a variety of groups who are actually using that streetscape. And then last but not least is the ongoing need to understand what people need in the city. So using disaggregated data to determine who benefits from the network. Other investments in programming or infrastructure changes that need to be made should be incorporated into the planning process. So that is it for me right now. I'll quickly make a plug for my podcast, Dense City, where I chat with academics about their research on cities. So you're here in this chat right now. You probably have an interest in some of these topics. And Léa, who will be speaking, is also one of the guests that I've had on prior. So I'll pass it over to Lanrick to talk about the next speaker. So thanks for listening.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Before I jump to Léa, just I wanted to know, how do we, the presentation was fantastic. How do we get kids involved in planning? How do they become like an equitable portion of the discussion, or is that still a bit of a murky piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think engagement with kids can be done more in schools as well, and like safe school en route programs. A lot of engagement is not happening with kids and not happening with their parents either. And people don't have a lot of time, right? So imagine someone, I imagine someone with kids doesn't have a lot of time to allocate to going to a town hall with their kids to make sure their child's voices are being heard. So I think doing things like mandatory education in schools, something that has been lacking in Canada, would be a great source of engagement for education and talking about what needs kids have themselves. So more kitchen table engagement that isn't done.
Fair. No, wonderful. Okay, thank you. All right, we're gonna go into our second presentation. Dr. Léa Ravensbergen is an assistant professor in the School of Earth, Environment and Society at McMaster University. Her research explores how cities can foster a more sustainable transport system in an equitable manner. She'll be speaking today about gender equity and cycling.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I made the mistake of sharing my screen before I unmuted myself. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you to Lanrick for the introduction and for the great moderation so far. Can everyone see my screen and hear me properly? Great. I'm going to do something slightly differently today. I'm going to try to convince you in 10 minutes that there is a gender bias in transport research and planning, that this bias permeates cycling research and planning, and that this bias needs to be considered when we think about that third question at the end of this seminar's title, which is, what do we need to foster the cycling city? What are the next steps? There are, of course, many biases in cycling research and in transport research, many of which have come up today, but I can't help but be in a room full of all these people already doing wonderful cycling work and not want to mention one that I think gets less attention. As a little bit of context, we do know that in places with low cycling rates, there is a gender gap in cycling where approximately 1/3 of cyclists identify as women and 2/3 identify as men. This exists in Toronto and Hamilton and the region, in most North American cities, but it disappears in places with high cycling rates. In places we keep mentioning Amsterdam, but also in many German cities or in Denmark. That gender gap disappears where you have more equal proportions of men and women who cycle, and sometimes even slightly more women that cycle. I bring this up to point out that this is not natural, this does not have to be normal, and this is something that we can and should change. I think women deserve the individual benefits of cyclists, and I think it'd be very hard to have a critical mass of cyclists without considering half of the population. And why does this gender gap exist? Well, we have two main theories behind that. One is the fact that these low cycling places are simply dangerous. And anybody who knows me knows that I can talk your ear off about this, but I think we all know this. We need this infrastructure. We need safer cycling cities. That is a key barrier. I want to take this opportunity today to talk about a second reason why we have this gender gap in cycling, and that is women's disproportionate responsibility over mobility of care. Mobility of care is all the travel required to upkeep a household. So this is all the travel needed in grocery, to do grocery shopping, to escort dependents like children or older dependents, to drop people off or yourself off at health appointments, to run errands. And recently, people have argued, including myself, that this type of travel is systematically underrepresented and underquantified in transport research. In fact, if we take our major travel surveys that determine a lot of the transport planning that we do in cities, they don't consider care as a category unto itself. This here is an example of the main categories for origins and destinations in Montreal. If you look here, work seems like the most important trip by a long shot, followed by leisure, drop off, pickup, that's care, but that's only 9%. But a lot of care trips don't really fall into any of these categories. If you go shopping for groceries or shopping for leisure, you're probably just going to put that under shopping, and there's no distinction, even though there's a very big difference between shopping for essential food and shopping for fun. Trips that are under 1 kilometer or short are often not considered as well, and a lot of care trips are short as well. In fact, if we're to recategorize these surveys to try to estimate what care is, and people who have directly measured how much travel is done for care, have found that they actually comprise, amongst working adults at least, a huge portion of daily trips. 28% of daily trips in this example of Montreal are trips for care purposes. But you don't feel like they're important trips when they don't have their own category, and we don't necessarily plan for them because we don't see them as important and significant. Here's just another way of looking at that. All of these subcategories don't get their own title, so they don't seem important. And this is where that gender bias comes in. Why do we care about mobility of care? Why is it important? Well, we find, like I said, these gender differences in who makes these trips. The trip to work is a bigger proportion of men's daily trips and smaller for women, and mobility of care is disproportionately done by women. Not only that, but there's also differences across intersectional identities. Here, if we look at just income and gender and the completion of mobility of care, you can see that gap of who does this travel, where here the orange lines represents women and the blue line represents men, is much larger in low-income households and narrows quite a bit in higher income households. So this is a question of low-income women doing this type of travel that gets systematically undervalued and underrepresented in travel surveys. I mentioned at the beginning there's other biases. These surveys so far don't even ask for race. We don't even know what that breakup is. Some aspects of identity aren't even considered. The good news is in Toronto, the 2022 TTS does, but we don't have that data yet. But there are many other biases, and you have to consider intersectional identities, and I have to kind of make it more simple here because that's just the data that we have. Now, you're going, why are you talking about care? I'm here to learn about bicycles. I think there's great potential to incorporate care into bicycle planning, and it's greatly important. Care trips tend to be a lot shorter than other trips. They tend to be closer to the home. So that's kind of something we really think is being great for active modes like cycling. But currently, car use is far more common for care trips and walking as well, so that's good. But people really don't use public transit and really don't use cycling for care trips. This here is, again, in work that I did in Montreal, but 2% of work trips across the whole city are done by bike, and I know that's low, but about half of that are for care. So we really aren't using the bicycle for care. But I think as a cyclist, there is great potential to be doing care by bicycle, and that we need to consider this when we're planning our cycling cities. I want to make sure Hamilton gets a little shout out because this is where I'm based now, but I promise I've lived in Toronto and lots of other places, and I see this bias everywhere. When we think of where our cycling investments take place, you've all mentioned really wonderful points about the inner city being prioritized. You've talked about gentrification, and all that stuff is so important. But I will point out that I often get frustrated that care just gets missed out. You'd be such a small extra step to just connect care destinations. And I'll give the example of my grocery store. I will say that most people probably live within 5 kilometers of where they go grocery shopping. That is a distance that we think we should be able to do by bike. And yet, and I'm embarrassed to say this amongst you all, especially those who I've taught, please don't judge me, but I drive to the grocery store and I should not be doing that. My old grocery store was here. You can see the bike lanes. That's the square I put up is where it's found. That's where the complex is. The bike lanes actually just stop right before that complex starts. They're there. This is part of the city that's almost the best served. But this is where the shopping complex actually looks like. It narrows down to very busy roads with absolutely no infrastructure. It's just kind of a sudden dead end in the infrastructure right by a care destination that is within cycling distance for me and for many people in this area. I hope this picture isn't hidden too much, but this is where the bike lane suddenly ends. This is also one of Hamilton's top most dangerous intersections, where we have the most injuries and fatalities, right by the grocery store. This is what it looks like going in. And yes, I did try biking here many, many times, but I was almost hit by Ford F-150s way too many times for me to want to continue doing that. There's very little visibility, there's no infrastructure, and it really comes all of a sudden. And the kicker is, hopefully you can see that, that's the bike parking. That is the worst bike parking I've ever seen. I hate it. It takes my wheel, it doesn't take the frame. If I have a pannier on my bike just plops right over. And I'd like to mention that people do bike here. They do, it's just not safe for them. But we're so close. These missing links are often care in the way that we plan for cycling. Just to give other examples, this is now my closest grocery store. This is downtown Hamilton. This is right between King and Main. Granted, this one doesn't have any bike lanes near it, but this, I should be biking to this grocery store. I am motivated, I have the skills, I have my panniers, I want to bike, but this is what it looks like. And it is so close to being connected to the network. So I don't, I drive. As another example, here's the other grocery store near my house. And again, this might look suburban, but this is in downtown Hamilton in the Barton Center. So with that, I think part of the Just Cycling City, and there's so much to consider in the Just Cycling City, but I wanted to bring in the importance of fostering a caring cycling city. I think this is important when we think about where we're putting our bicycle infrastructure, and that often there's some examples where literally just a little bit more would connect care, but I don't think anybody's even thinking about care. I think this matters in terms of not just the bike lanes, which get a lot of attention for important reasons, but also bike parking. Where is that bike parking going? Where are bike share stations going? What kind of parking? And what kind of bicycles are we planning this infrastructure for? If you're doing care, you're likely going to have, you're not going to be on a racing bike. You're probably going to be on a cruiser with nice big panniers that take up a little more space. You might have a lovely cargo bike. When we're planning our infrastructure, you want to make sure that there's room to overtake cargo bikes. The cargo bikes can actually lock in the parking that's provided, and so on. And I think planning for this caring cycling city is important part of cycling and reducing that gender gap. And that gender gap's also an income gap, and is very possibly also all sorts of other identity gaps that we just don't know because we just don't collect the data. But I would also like, as a final caveat, and again, anybody who's ever taken any of my courses, this isn't just about gender. Come on, boys, let's do the grocery shopping too. This doesn't have to be women that does this labor. Let's reduce that gap to begin with and make sure that the caring cycling city is the city where anyone can perform care by bike. I did not keep track of time there, so apologies if that was way too fast or way too short, but thank you.
You went over by all of like 3 seconds. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I really enjoy grocery shopping with my cargo bike, but completely agree with the bike parking. What advice can you give advocates as to where they should be targeting letters, their campaigns? How do we get a No Frills or Loblaws or a Safeway, or how do we get them to understand that if they want more of me, more of my wife, more of our friends to be coming to their businesses, that creating space for yes, cargo bikes and cruisers and something other than, what advice could you give us just to start that piece of dialogue?
I mean, my main advice is just to remind people that these are 28% of people's trips. So they are important, and that we just consider them. That's all I'm asking for. I'm not even asking for anything big. When we're thinking of cycling advocacy, don't focus just on the trip to work. That's an important trip, and you're all working so hard. I'm not trying to make you do more. But do remember care trips. They're not just grocery stores too, even though I use that example. That's dropping kids off at school. That's hospitals. And I know, as an example, you know, in Hamilton, again, there's a new bike lane going in because there's room on hospital property, but they're not connecting the lane to the hospital entrance because there's just this bias where you assume nobody's going to bike to the hospital, everybody's going to drive there. And obviously, many cases you can't bike to the hospital, but many times I get checked up, I could easily bike to the hospital,
Sure,
right? Like, so when you think of how, I know that I could speak for ages about it, but I'm mostly hoping that you just think about it, even though it's a little more challenging, but counter that bias and realize that that bias exists and challenge yourself to consider care.
All right, thank you so much. I want to just make sure that our third speaker is in the house, and I'm just doing a very quick look for myself before I introduce. He is wonderful. Okay, so let me do my third introduction here. Kojo Damptey is an interdisciplinary educator and facilitator. His area of interest is social justice, with a focus on leadership theory, anti-racism, international development studies, and post-colonial studies. He approaches these disciplines from an anti-oppressive framework with a foundation in Afrocentric traditions and culture. He also uses art, specifically music, to raise awareness on issues of human rights and equity from the perspective of Guyana and African. He's also from Hamilton, and I'm so pleased that he is a part of this group, and hopefully I get to see him in the flesh one day sooner than not. But Kojo, turning it over to yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Yes, okay, great. Yeah, you're getting some Hamilton content here, back to back. I hope you're not bored with all the Hamilton content. Thank you very much, and my apologies for attending late. I was teaching and I had to join after teaching. But I did catch the two previous speakers, and my session here is just built on some of the things that they have been talking about. Before I start, I wanted to see if I could share this with you. Hopefully it works. Where do share the screen? Hold on. Let me see if I can. Okay, can everyone see this? I know you might be in my
We're in your Twitter, yep.
Yeah, so that's the only place I could find it. So my apologies. But I wanted to showcase this because this centers on my talk. And my talk is just cycling, right? Talking about a justice of cycling and not just cycling, right? And so here, this is called the Westcliff Bike Bus, organized by community members to ensure that parents, children, caregivers are building that culture of cycling. And again, it's not just cycling, but it's also the process of building community and also the process of sharing stories about how people come into cycling. And I think that's one thing that we tend to forget when we talk about cycling infrastructure. So I say that, look, as capitalism reigns over countries and municipalities, the path forward in a climatic environment, and I use that word specifically because we're in a climate disaster, means that we need to respond appropriately, not just as a way of moving from point A to point B, but responding to climate stewardship and active transportation that centers on justice, which invariably means that we have to start thinking about how we are all connected on these issues of being great stewards of indigenous land, which we are on, and also connecting the experiences of different folks, women, towards LGBTQIA+ communities, newcomer communities, refugee communities, Black and racialized communities, so that we are building, if I can steal Léa's title, we are building a just and caring society. So these are the things that we need to work on. I did catch Rebecca's presentation, and I'm glad I caught it, because sometimes if you do not understand the institution that provides the infrastructure, sometimes we get lost. And Rebecca is right. Cycling infrastructure is based on development charges. Cycling infrastructure is based on what council wants and what they don't want. Here in Hamilton, there was a specific councillor that prevented a bike lane from being implemented because he was concerned about cars not being able to turn right. So we have to take back that power. And the tweet here is community members taking back that power to say, look, let's start a bike bus. Let's meet up at a park and talk about issues that are connected or that every resident is facing. Then coming up with those solutions and building community to then respond to these needs. Here in Hamilton, we just found out that a resident lost their life. And so on Friday, tomorrow, we are getting together. This is the second ghost bus we've had to get around because of a lack of care and an important cycling infrastructure here in Hamilton. So for us, it's getting together, building community, talking about how do we seriously talk about building a just city in terms of, again, identifying that, yes, we come with different experiences and we do have to talk about it. Léa called out the patriarchy that we see, and we have to talk about it. These are the things that if we do not bring ourselves to bear in being humble and being respectful, then we lose out, because it's not just about building separated bike lanes and what have you, but it's about how do we ensure that these things are connected to our experiences, and we're building a city of care, a city that's also able to respond to the climate disaster that is set to us right now. So this I wanted to kind of crystallize that and say that at least here in Hamilton, the culture of that is being built, and I believe that some of those folks that are building that culture are actually here with you virtually. And I also want to give them a big shout out and a big appreciation for all the work that they are doing. So I hope in whatever municipality that you are in, that we continue to get together as a group, we share some of the ideas that we are doing, so that each day, each meeting, each policy document, each development charge, whatever it might be, each survey, each town hall, we are really critically looking at how we can build a just city, and not just cycling through our city. So I will end there, and if there are any questions, we can definitely talk about them. Thank you.
Kojo, thank you so much. A question right off the top, and maybe you can dig a bit deeper into this. Why is it so important to have story be a part of that just frame? Why does story have such a significance in realizing that just frame for biking, cycling?
Because we all come to it from different places. if you're a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old going to school or trying to cycle to school, and you've had a near-death experience, right? You need to hear that. If you are a newcomer who has lost a bike going to grocery store, you need to hear that. I'll even make this more clear. If you look at any encampment across the country, you will notice that encampment residents have bicycles. Why? Right? So when you hear how people utilize cycling, that then gives you a clear picture of why it's so important and why we need to provide more opportunities for cycling and building community. So I think stories are very, very important. I think I just saw Mark Anderson in here. I gave him the title, the cycling mayor of Hamilton.
He's got to take that on. He's got to take that on. He's got to take it.
He meets with residents by Bayfront, and they are always talking. I've met him numerous times. I've heard some of the stories, and those things are important because it informs how we want to build a just city. So it's very, very important. And whether they are gendered stories, whether they're racialized stories, we need to hear the story so that we can respond appropriately.
One of my really quick stories and why I became an advocate. Before I even say that, just thank you so much to our three. Open it up to my real quick story of becoming an advocate was because of my daughter. So at 9 years old, my daughter walked into the kitchen and demanded that she be allowed to ride her bike to school. And my wife is a nurse and she rides to work. I didn't have a bike at the time. And so it was kind of on me to be riding with my 9-year-old. And here I was basically putting myself in the street while I was putting my daughter in a painted bike lane. We had a wonderful time. It was scary at times, but a wonderful time riding together. Unfortunately, one morning, we missed a crash that took the life of another father. And my daughter lasted maybe 2 more months riding with me, and then she gave up. And that was after she wrote to our counselor, wrote to our mayor, wrote to our trustee, wrote to our MPP, and got no feedback that in her 9-year-old mind felt that they were taking appreciation of her fear and want to make it safer for herself and her friends and her dad to be able to ride to school. So that's my story. That's my origin story of why I've become such an advocate for fighting for vulnerable road users and wanting a more just I want less cars for sure, but I want there to be a prioritization of people that are outside of a 3,000-pound steel box. Okay, but get into questions. Here is one for Léa. How do velomobilities of care differ between downtown and suburbia? What kinds of infrastructures can help support care trips? And are women's perspectives being listened to?
Oh, those are 3 big questions. How much time do we have?
The floor is yours.
Downtown and the suburbs, I think that's an excellent question, but there's actually probably people here who know more than me. One thing that I will mention is I did do some work on how to encourage velomobilities of care, how people can use their bicycles. And what I found there was that people, at least in Toronto at the time, did not feel like it was safe cycling with their children. It was really a question of safety when it comes to that. And that people really wanted to buy groceries with their bikes. Like a lot of people live surprisingly close to the grocery store. and especially if they're using transit, wanted to save money by not using transit and using their bicycles.
Yeah.
And what's hard about grocery stores is that it's a mix of municipal property and private property, and that often that municipal property, I think, doesn't connect the cycling network to that care destination. But even in the rare cases where it does, and you do have a bike lane to your grocery store, you enter it, and it's like the pictures I shared, a completely inhospitable.
This massive space for the cars to come in, but nothing necessarily for yourself in a bike to feel safe making it in there. Yeah.
I'd love to just force them to put in bike lanes in parking lots and grocery stores, but I guess that's not possible. So it's a question of advocating, letting people know that you do want to buy groceries, that you're a customer, like this is how you want to get there. But yeah, there's a few key points.
The last piece, just are women's perspectives being listened to? Are you sensing any movement in that regard?
Not really. I think people, I like talking about gender biases because I think we don't think of them because we think that there is no gender difference in transport, right? People are surprised when you talk about gender because you think, oh, that's fine. Men and women are the same when it comes to traveling. There's still many other big inequities. And there's just something so kind of ingrained that you don't even notice it anymore, that that you do travel differently and that those household responsibilities are different, that I like that way, that it's less obvious. So I don't think we necessarily are considered, and when it is, I don't know if it's even considered a gendered issue, right? Because a lot of these things don't have to be gendered issues. Lanrick, your story, that's a care trip. You became a cyclist because of a care trip, and that's great. That shows how these are not natural. Everybody does care. It's just undervalued, underrepresented, and currently disproportionately done by women, and especially low-income women. It doesn't have to be that way.
That's right. Okay, thank you. This question is to Rebecca. I'm thinking about your real decision-making process chart. I am too. I'd really like a copy of that so I can show it to my counselor. So the real decision-making process chart, and wondered where the issues Léa and Kojo raised fit in or don't, and how to fill in those gaps.
That's a great question, incorporating everything. Yeah, it's throughout the entire process, but one of the main things that I've had research participants say and within the literature is really influencing all of these decisions from your long-term, long-range planning process, and having things like gender and race and other inequities that exist in our cities outlined in municipal planning documents, and needing to address them will hold councilors accountable. So when all of these engagements happen and there's pushback on a piece of cycling infrastructure, and you can say, well, your latest 10-year plan outlined this as an issue and you need to address it, similar to climate change emergencies, right? You've declared that climate change is an emergency, so follow suit with this plan that is in line with it. So making it about a policy they've already approved and they've already put their name on, I think is a better way of tackling it than doing every single project and saying, no, you need to connect this to the school. It should be written into the documents that every school needs to be connected to its student neighborhood, right? That's like a given. It would make sense. And just, it would be standardized because of that, because it's part of this longer range planning. And then also having things like mandatory education and connections to schools, grocery stores, places where people need to go. And even things like mixed use development and land uses are also important so that people can live where they work, where they play, where they need to go grocery shopping and go to school. And then perhaps the mobilities of care won't even be an issue because someone will be able to bike their kid to school on their way to work because that's their mode of choice, because it makes sense. So making the bike the cheaper, fastest, quickest option. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna segue, Kojo, to yourself, bringing back the image of the bike bus, and I'm wondering just your thoughts on how a bike bus, maybe even explaining it if you could, why something like that could enable inequities to maybe be softened. And allow for a more just movement of people, of kids, specifically kids. I'm wondering if you want to maybe tackle the good in what a bike bus could bring.
Yeah, I mean, it could do lots of things. So Rebecca spoke about the decision makers, right? So when we, the number of times we've had a bike bus here in Hamilton, I think one of them, the principal actually joined, and he was surprised that it was so unsafe.
Right.
So now the gears in his mind are like, all right, as a principal, if I want to encourage healthy living and healthy activity for young children coming to school, what can I do? So he speaks to the superintendent. Hopefully the superintendent will speak to whoever their supervisor is, right? And then it also shows us the publicly shows us how inequitable our society is, right? And I think Rebecca said this. It makes sense that anyone should be able to bike to school without being exposed to speeding cars and all of that, right? I think here in Hamilton there's a group called the the daily school route, right? They are saying, look, anybody that lives within 1 or 10 kilometers of their school should be able to walk or bike to school safely. It makes sense. But then you don't get the buy-in from the decision makers. And that's the problem. And so I think for us as folks that support active transportation and all of the things that we've been talking about this morning, that's why we need to continue to build community so that eventually we have the numbers. I know the Toronto, now I can move to Toronto, right? After Hamilton, seeing your mayor lead a group of cyclists going to work. I mean, that in itself is a statement, whether it's performative or whether you think it's a one-time thing, that is still a huge success. So for all of us, I think is just trying to build out that community, right? So that when it's time to push the decision makers, then now we have the numbers that we need to make sure that they make those changes in policy and in the votes and the motions and the bylaws that they make.
It is, thank you. It is a wonderfully weird piece bumping into your mayor on her bike. And I mean, I will say that it's so much more than performative. Like that is just how the mayor gets around. So it is still kind of just one of those, that's really cool. Okay, a question to all the presenters, because we're going to be wrapping up in about 7 minutes here. How can cycling contribute to a more just city? Can cycling produce more just ways of life, and what barriers are there to achieving this? And maybe we'll start with Léa.
It's a great question, because there is a great irony that one of the most efficient and affordable ways of getting around gets associated with like elitist gentrifiers. And I really appreciate Kojo mentioning that. I know I've noticed that when you walk around Hamilton and you see people living in encampments, a lot of them are biking. And when you notice the people who do bike to those grocery stores that I showed pictures of, it is often that population that is the best way for them because they don't have other options. So that's just a really interesting hypocrisy that exists. And I find that kind of shocking that driving, which takes up an incredible amount of city space that could be used for housing, that is incredibly expensive to own, operate, insure, and gas, is somehow associated as an affordable way to, a mobility for the people, whereas cycling, which is far more affordable and still flexible, is somehow associated with elitism. So I don't think there's anything inherent about the modes that make them that way. And it's more of a social and reasons behind them that I hope we can change.
Fair. Kojo, how can cycling contribute to a more just city?
In many ways, I cited the example of children, right? Their right to healthy, active neighborhoods. It's their inherent right, especially when they're going to school, when they're going to their parks, when they're going to see their friends, when it's hot and they want to go to the splash pad or a cooling center. Like, why do they have to depend on their parents driving a car, right? Yeah. So I think that is a clear example. And again, to tie to what Rebecca said, if cities are declaring climate emergencies, then they better make sure they have an integrated cycling infrastructure. Because what happens if people need to get from point A to point B and all we have is roads, right? So I think we need to change our mode from universal thinking to pluriversal thinking. And sometimes that's what capitalism does. It says, you're a man, you're a woman, that's it. You make profit, you make loss, that's it. No, let's think of multiple ways of how we can care for each other, we can support each other, we can get to places, we can make sure that any and everybody, regardless of their age, can maneuver across the city without having to pay exorbitant prices. So I think those are the contributions that a just cycling city provides for everyone.
Rebecca, I'm going to give you like 2 minutes on this, but how can cycling contribute to a more just city?
Yeah, I mean, some of my recent work, just talking to people who have lived in both Canada and the Netherlands for a period of time, they were reflecting on how everybody bikes, and you go out in public and you see all of your neighbors, you see your community face to face. There's no barrier between you, and that lack of a barrier permeates through their society, and they start to see each other as neighbors and as this more collective society. So I think there's a lot of benefits to that. And also different things like social capital, sharing with neighbors, sharing time, sharing care loads and trips, and coming at cycling as this more collectivist idea, perhaps is a good shift in our minds. And yeah, because right now cars are very individualistic behaviors and mechanisms, and you can see that on the street. So bringing back streets to people, streets to neighbors, streets to communities would be a good first step.
Nice. Last question to all three of you, just off the top of my head. Rebecca, what type of bike do you ride? What's your bike of choice?
Okay, my bike of choice would be like an e-bike or something, like fancy Urban Arrow or something. Actually, no, I ride a crappy Canadian Tire bike because I don't want my bike to be stolen. So I ride my bike on a bikeway outside of my street here in Squamish, BC, where I'm living. And I go climbing, and I have all of my ropes and stuff on my back pannier. And yeah, so you can reach your recreational destinations via bike too.
Fair. Léa, what are you riding?
I ride the most beautiful baby blue cruiser that every time I ride it, I get a comment about how pretty my bike is. And so it might get stolen soon. I also use Hamilton bike share bikes in the winter a lot to save my beautiful blue cruiser from getting all rusty.
Kojo, what are you riding?
Yeah, it's just a Canadian type bike. Quick tidbit. I ran for city council and I painted it, and I used it to go canvassing every day. And I have left the colors on because it's my way of making sure that it doesn't get stolen. Because if anybody steals it, people definitely know that person is not Kojo.
All right. Thank you, panelists. I'm going to turn this over to Thomas to lead us out. Thanks, everyone. This was wonderful.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lanrick, and thank you to our presenters for our last session. I would like to thank all our attendees, our audience, for a really great turnout. And even after such a long morning and now afternoon in Toronto, and it's evening here in Manchester, of sessions, and we still have really a great turnout. So yeah, I don't know if David, Matty, or Léa would like to provide some last comments as we close this out. Just so you know, some housekeeping, we will be posting the sessions online so you can review them at your leisure later. We'll also try to get the presentations from all our presenters, those that want to share them, and we'll be circulating those to all our attendees. And finally, we also intend to publish a small reflection on today's event, an event recap with a bit of a commentary on kind of the central questions of the event, which is where are we at with cycling in the GTHA and where are we going? So thank you very much. This was a great event. Really enjoyed all the presentations and the audience participation. So I think we're all very happy with that. Just turn it over to my co-organizers who really helped out a lot with this event.
I'll just say a huge thank you. It was really great to also see the diversity of speakers and attendees. Hamilton represent. Nice. Thanks for coming.
Amazing work, Thomas, and all the speakers. Just a fantastic discussion. And hopefully this is the first of many. We need more of these conversations to share our insights and learn from each other. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, just thank you, everyone, for joining, the incredible panelists and moderators. And of course to Matty and Léa and Thomas for doing so much work and putting it together. It's been fantastic.
Have a great day, everyone.